friends of Walt and Jan's, and I offered to Jan if she would put together some things that perhaps people didn't know about Walt, that I would be happy to read those this afternoon. So my first thanks goes to Jan for being so patient and allowing me to ask her to repeat her stories because someone didn't take notes the first time. And then also for allowing her to read, allowing me to read the letters that Walt wrote home during the time that he was in the Army. Very, very interesting, and I'll try to provide you with some of those highlights as we go through today. I think one thing that we could say about Walt is that he was always very curious, and he did tend to build some of his own things. And this started at a very early age. In fact, his curiosity almost got the best of him. I understand that his dog Princey had to drag him out of the street by his diaper so he didn't get killed trying to find out what was across the street. He also, at 2.5, built his own toy airplane. Now, both of these characteristics you'll see as we go through some of these things that you may not have known about Walt. Shortly after he graduated high school, he went into the Army, and perhaps this was because he was in ROTC in high school. He was assigned to the Signal Corps, which is a communication group, which made all the sense in the world. Because as a preteen, he and a good friend who lived 2 blocks away across a very busy street in L.A. strung wires between their 2 houses so that they could communicate by radio. Shortly after going into the Army and getting through boot camp, he went to school in Georgia. He did well in physics and math, not so well in English and history. And knowing Walt, it was not surprising that he had taken his $3 slide rule with him to the Army and wrote home for his good slide rule while he was in school. He also wrote home for math and radio books. After school, which was terminated early because of the war, he had a number of assignments. He first started out as an infantryman. He was a gunner on a tank. He then became a tank driver. There is a rumor that a fountain in a square in one of the European towns that he drove through may have suffered some damage. And after I read this excerpt from a letter, you may judge for yourself whether you think that rumor might be true. This letter was written from Augsburg, Germany, September 21st, 1945. Several days ago, I took a tank from here to a town about 50 miles from here. I had it on the Autobahn doing about 35 when the track broke. We took off through some woods, and by the time I got it stopped, we had mowed down about 15 trees, large trees, and through one barn. It was really fun. Later on his tour, he served as the brigade librarian, which was a 2-hour-a-day job because the library was only open 2 hours, which left him time for sports, which we'll get into later. He then became a tank destroyer driver and ended up shortly before he was discharged in charge of the coal and gas works in Augsburg, Germany. In the Army, he had an opportunity to begin his love for wine. In France, they drank wine with every meal because the water wasn't good. They also commandeered a building which happened to have champagne in the basement, about 3.5 bottles per person. And at his 21st birthday in Augsburg, Germany, he got $10 bottles of wine as birthday presents. After the Army, based on having been a librarian for the brigade, he worked in the library in L.A. But we all know Walt. He didn't just work in the library. He and a buddy dropped books of various sizes, shapes, and weights down the elevator shaft and timed them to see if those factors made a difference in the time of fall. And one thing to note is that after returning from the Army, Walt became a very good student in all of his coursework. Now, Jan has covered his major employment in what she has written, but there are a couple of related stories. Prior to American Airlines Admirals Club, there was the Admirals Fleet, and you had to make a significant contribution to air transportation to get in. So Walt thought about this and wrote a perhaps slightly exaggerated version of some of his military contributions and was accepted into the Admirals Fleet. His American Airlines Admirals Club number is a bunch of zeros followed by a very few numbers. Walt was very active in sports. His skiing started in Murman, Germany, where his girlfriend, who held several skiing records, taught him to ski. His first skis were the very long ones. I'm sure you've seen pictures where the skis were well above their heads. Well, he cut off the back, adjusted the footrests, and off he went. Various comments that he made in his letters were that these cut-off skis felt like being on solid ice. He also said, if I stay here long enough, I might be able to ski on my feet instead of on my head. And skiing is a wonderful sport if you don't break your neck learning. Walt enjoyed skiing through most of his life. Remember his 2-hour-day job in the library? That left him time not only for skiing, but also swimming, horseback riding, fishing, hunting, and hiking, and he even had a pet deer. He continued the fishing after returning home as a fly fisherman. Walt was a very good tennis player, and in fact, he used tennis to court Jan. Walt invited Jan to go play tennis. She accepted and immediately went out and started taking lessons so she wouldn't look too foolish on the court with Walt. During his working career, he and his colleagues went on backpacking trips in the Sierras. Continuing his love of wine, one mule was designated as the wine hauler on these trips. And perhaps this is why on one of the trips they came very close to starting a forest fire. But they were able to extinguish the single tree that they had caught on fire before it spread. Walt was a distance ocean swimmer. He swam miles around the piers and up and down the coast of California. And he had a number of interests in addition to sports. His earliest interest was probably photography. He had several cameras before going into the Army, as well as an enlarger at home. This continued in the Army. He asked for 2 cameras to be sent to him while he was still in the States. And he went broke buying film in Miami Beach. I don't know what he was taking pictures of there. And he commented that the live tracer bullets fired over the infiltration course would make a beautiful picture at night. He did return the cameras home before he deployed, but in July of 1945, he started a commercial photography shop in Murman, Germany, and acquired at least 2 cameras in Germany, probably by trade. This also continued after he returned home. Jan tells me that he would turn their bathroom into a dark room, leaving it unavailable for her. And Once again, he made his own equipment for developing and enlarging photos. Walt loved astronomy and had a variety of telescopes throughout his life. Jan talks about stumbling after him many times as they hiked into the wilderness to get away from the lights. Walt was an avid sailor. He had a sailboat in partnership with a gentleman named Ralph, which they kept at Marina del Rey. When he met Jan, he belonged to a sailing club and could take out whatever boat he wanted to from the club. Walt loved it, Jan not so much. First few trips, she chummed the fish. And then she took Dramamine and would sleep. And as they were coming back into shore, she would wake up and Walt would say, "Did you have a good time?" Walt was also an avid reader. And you might expect him to read fairly light books, but not Walt. This was probably 3 or 4 years ago. He read a book on string theory, which is a theory in physics, and while he could understand it, he attempted to explain it to me, and it was not his explanation, it was my dumbness. I couldn't understand string theory. Actually, he read quite a variety of books. He was also interested in classical music. When he was a boy, he would sneak either into or very close to the Hollywood Bowl to enjoy the music. His interests were very broad, and I can attest to this because when we had Jan and Walt's 20th anniversary party, our son, who was a preteen, our grandson, who was a preteen at that time, wasn't particularly interested in coming, but he was there. And he sat with a group that included Walt and myself, and the whole evening listened to Walt's stories. And our grandson's father came by to say, "All right, it's time to go home." He looked up and said, "Okay," and continued to sit there. And his dad said, "No, you got to go." He was that interested in the things that Walt had to say. And then last year after Thanksgiving, Jan and Walt were at our house along with our family. And after dinner, we were all up and picking up things, and Jake and Walt, our grandson, was sitting in the dining room with Walt, and they were talking. And the next day, we said to Jake, "That was so nice of you to talk to Walt." And he says, "He's a really interesting man." And he is. And I have one more Walt story. This occurred when he was a Boy Scout, so probably early teenager. About 1935, probably. So you've got to remember that Los Angeles was not nearly as populated as it is now. And the Boy Scouts were camping up in the hills just outside of L.A. And so Walt and 2 of his friends decided they were going to hike back into town after lights out. So they wandered down through this ravine and got into town looking fairly scruffy because it had been dusty and dirty, and their clothes were kind of disheveled. And it just so happened that the police were out looking for 3 people who had just robbed a liquor store. And the patrol officer came upon these 3 people, loaded them in the back seat of his car, took them to the station, and for whatever reason, he couldn't park on the street. So he just told them to get out and go into the station to see the desk sergeant. So they got out, went into the station. The desk sergeant wasn't behind the desk. They continued on out the back door, back up the ravine to camp, with nobody being the wiser. Are there others who would like to share some Walt stories?
I would.
Sure.
Do you want me to come there? Or?
Yeah.
I might be knowing more from before many of you because I worked with Walt. I'll get a little emotional, Jan. So, Joyce Taylor's husband, who's passed away, but he and I worked with Walt and with Jan. And I got to tell you, he was a real mentor to me. I can remember some of the first meetings when I went in. He was my boss in the sense. He was a program manager and I was an engineering manager. And I can remember watching him and saying, that's kind of the demeanor I'd like to have in meetings. That's the way I'd like to act. He was just classy and sharp in the way he handled his business career. I don't know, I don't believe I ever heard anybody say a bad thing about Walt. I never hear him say a bad thing about anybody else. He just was a classy individual and a good engineer. And he and I had, I think, a good relationship. First time I negotiated my engineering contract with him, and Jan will know all about these things, but he'd said, okay, well, that's a good number, but I'm going to take 10% because you always take 10% off, you engineers. And I was pretty naive at the time. I said, no, I didn't. This is what I think it's going to take to do the job. And I think it's my obligation to you as my manager to know that this is what I think should be done. I don't know if he believed me, but I believe it set a kind of a tone between us. I think he trusted me when I said things, and I trusted that he would back me up. And there were several times when things didn't go too good for the program, and he didn't say like some, well, Tal the line down there screwed up. I told him not to do that. He never did that. Backed me up all the time. And just one other little thing. I could probably talk for hours, Jan, but I won't. One other thing, we went on a business trip once that showed me his class, and we were in rooms next to each other, and right across from my room was a bunch of women drinking and having a party. A bunch of school teachers were there for a convention. And I had my bag and my thing, and I opened the door and started in, and I could tell they were following me. But before I could turn, the door slammed on them. And I heard the one woman say, he shut the door on us. And I thought, oh, is it going to be worse to go back out? And I didn't do anything. So when Walt got ready to go to lunch, he said, let's just go over. And he went over, and in the smooth way he has, he had a drink with them. He made things right. And it was impressive to me to see how he handled that situation that I didn't know how to handle. The only other thing, I guess, would be as far as his driving and his tank. We came home from one business trip in the east, and we couldn't get into LAX, so they sent us to San Diego. And he was an impatient person. I don't know if he was always that way, Jan, but he was impatient. He didn't want to wait. They were going to line up this bus for us. And he'd keep saying, when? I said, well, just a few minutes. And finally, he says, I'm through with that. He rented a car. We went down there because there was fog between LA. He drove home about 60, 70 miles an hour in the fog. I never saw the road more than 20 feet in front of it, and I finally went to sleep to save myself. But he got us there safely, okay? I'm sure there's a million other things I could tell you about Walt and the way he did business and how the people at Hughes respected him. But that's the main things I do. I really loved Walt as a friend and a good man and somebody that I love to work with.
Others? Is this a microphone?
No, you have to go up there.
That's a stand. We can't get up there.
That one's taking your picture.
Hi, my name is Jim Mooney. My wife Phyllis is back there. A lot of women know her. I asked Jan if I could say a few words, and I promise I will only say a few words. Roger Smith became chairman of General Motors, and shortly thereafter he purchased, or had the corporation purchase, used aircraft. I was at a party, or we were at a party, a Monarch party at
Randall's one evening, and I walked by and Walt was talking to somebody, and Roger Smith's name came up. And I want to tell you, Walt did not approve of that purchase of his at all. And he had no use for Roger Smith and didn't mince any words. Well, I worked for General Motors. Matter of fact, I was working at the General Motors building in Detroit when Roger replaced Tom Murphy as the chairman. I had no use for I had no use for Roger either. But so we hit it off right off the bat. And we became dinner partners. Phyllis and I and Jan and Walt would go out to dinner every now and then. And I enjoyed Walt because he stayed up with everything. He knew what was happening in the world, and we enjoyed our discussions in politics. Sometimes they got pretty heated. But he was just a great guy to have an argument with. And we enjoyed I think we both enjoyed it very much. But to end up this presentation, I was very, very proud of Walt for having served his country in Europe during World War II. Now, the one story that hasn't been told is the fact that Walt was in one of the groups that was sent to Bastogne to get those guys at General McAuliffe's 101st Airborne Division that was stuck there because of the Battle of the Bulge. They faced probably one of the largest armies ever massed. That was a drive that Hitler was going to make that was going to win the war for him, his last ditch. But he was there and he fought. And one evening, I could never get him to talk about his experience in Europe. And one night I said, Walt, you were just a young kid, new to Europe, and you were thrown into that battle. That had to be kind of scary, wasn't it? And in his own way, he said, yeah, it was. That was it. No other conversation. Thank you, Jan, for letting me say those few words. God bless you all.
Hey, Jan, would you come sit up here? Would you?
In deference to you, I did not use one of the stories that Jan said because I didn't know whether you would use it or not. You always thought of Walt as very proper and prim, but he had a politically incorrect coffee cup. It was a Playboy coffee cup, which he was extremely proud of. It was basic black, but on the top of the handle where you put your thumb was the little Playboy image. So he could cover it if he had to, but he could also leave it open. Kim?
He kept it covered pretty good. I never saw it.
I noticed Alvin drove me crazy. You may not have seen these as you leave. They're in the library, just to at the door at the left on your way outside. What's that? Oh, and there's a book that you can sign in also in there. So Jan chose the Hebrew proverb, say not in grief he is no more, but live in thankfulness that he was. That was beautiful. Okay, so Jan, I want to thank you for inviting us into your home to celebrate Walt's life.
Thank you all for being here. I love you all.
And the deal is, it is just such a gift to us to be here remembering him, listening to these stories, but also to acknowledge who you were together. Because most of us in this room would never have known Walt if it wasn't for you. We would have never known this beautiful, almost 30-year love affair. 30-year love affair. I know you fell in love playing tennis, and that led to hiking It led to traveling, sharing books, sharing beloved friends. Really, you loved each other's ability to be independent thinkers. He loved your creativity. You were each other's yin and your yang, the yin and the yang. And you were each other's best friends. And the love. And the love. And in the end, that's what we have. We have the love that holds his memory in our hearts forever. So, Jan was reading a book named Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. That sounds like a book she would read. Also, it sounds like a book that Walt would read. And she came upon a passage that just really stuck with her, that sounded like exactly something Walt would say. So I'm going to read this little short passage, and then after I'm finished, let's make a toast to Walt. Let's send it out into the universe. So the passage goes like this. This is not a full circle. It's life carrying on. It's the breath we all take. It's the choice we make to get on with it. If you know Walt, that does sound like Walt. You know what? Not all of us have drinks in our hands, and that's fine. Raise your hand. Let's stand up. Grab a hand. It's all about intention, huh? Okay, here's to a life well lived. Dear friend, dear husband, dear father, to a man who was undeniably loved by everyone who knew him. Rest in peace, Walter Lee Allen. Rest in peace.
That's what I thought about when, how he took care of that whole thing. So where are you going to stay while you're here?